Compassion, the ability to feel with the other in the way we've been thinking about this evening, is not only the test of any true religiosity, it is also what will bring us into the presence of what Jews, Christians, and Muslims call God, or the divine. It is compassion, says the Buddha, which brings you to nirvana.
Compassion. The act of looking out for others in the same way as you look out for yourself. We do come across the term quite often, don't we? Be it on Oprah or your favorite podcast or in the vast oceans of self-help literature. But the question still remains though, why should I care about others? Why should I not act in my own self-interest all of the time? I, for one, in my own life always tend to act as if I'm the main character and others are just a supporting cast. Is the reason something very basic like do to others as you want others to do to you? That can't be it, right? Because that's again a selfish motive. I'm being nice to you because I want you to treat me nicely and not because I really want to. It's like my entire corporate life summed up in one sentence. I hate my colleagues and my boss and all those annoying stakeholders, yet I still have to pretend to be nice to them, hoping they reciprocate and don't fire my sorry ass. Surely this can't be the right way to approach compassion, right? I mean, there's gotta be a more selfless, a more real way to look at compassion. Is what the Buddha said about 2000 years ago. 6 years after leaving his wife and children at home and putting himself through all sorts of harsh austerities, he woke up one day from a state of deep, tranquil meditation and decided to drop a truth bomb the size of Mount Everest. Well, I added that for dramatic effect. It wasn't really any single solitary thing that he said, there were a bunch of truth bombs, to be honest. But the one we're interested in today is called anatta, or the doctrine of no self. The Buddha tells us that what we call the self is basically just a strong illusion created by the 5 skandhas or aggregates. If you try to search for a permanent self, you will end up being disappointed, as there is no permanent self, only the 5 impermanent skandhas that are in a constant state of change. Think about a chariot. The Buddha will say that there is no such thing as a real chariot. If you take away the axle and the spokes and the wheels, what is left of the chariot? Nothing, right? So the chariot, the Buddha says, is just a convenient label used to describe an arrangement of parts. This is known as pratita samudayapa, or dependent origination, the view that parts are real but wholes are not. If we cling on to the permanent idea of the chariot, the Buddha says it will lead to disappointment or dukkha, as what we call the chariot is simply made up of impermanent components that are all in turn subject to rust and decay. Similarly, if we cling on to a permanent idea of ourselves, it would leave us with despair, as just like the chariot, the self is also just a convenient label used to describe the 5 skandhas. It's pretty neat, isn't it? This fresh off-the-boat view of the self was in stark contrast with the existing schools of thought in Buddha's time. For example, in the Brahmanic tradition, very popular at the time, it was believed that each person had an unchanging essence. This essence or self was thought to be eternal, and it was believed that with enough devotion and reasoning one could achieve complete control over not only their own selves, but also over the entire universe. The Buddha was careful about making sweeping statements like these. Instead, he asks us to consider the middle path. Everything exists is one extreme, and everything does not exist is another extreme. Without approaching either extreme, he prescribes the middle path. Shit gives rise to other shit under certain causal conditions, and shit ceases to exist when the relevant causal conditions are gone. This is how Buddha employs dependent origination to explain why shit exists in the world without resorting to the concept of a permanent entity. The same idea is illustrated beautifully in an exchange between Buddha and this guy, where the Buddha refuses to answer his question of is there no self. Buddha's silence on this matter has been interpreted as the middle path, where he disagrees with the eternalists who say that a permanent self exists, but he also wishes to avoid aligning himself with the annihilationists, who were an emerging sect at the time and were prescribing a kind of moral nihilism as a way of life. Later in the Ananda Sutta, Buddha himself explains why he chose to not answer Vacchagotta. Now, honestly speaking, it would have been so much cooler if he said something like, I just wanted to get rid of the guy, or I just didn't know the answer, but instead he says this. If I had answered, there is no self, the wanderer Vacchagotta, already confused, would have fallen into even greater confusion. Thinking to himself, it seems like the self I once had no longer exists now. So, to sum things up, teachings of the Buddha essentially rely on two truths. One is the ultimate truth, which is the doctrine of no self or anatta, and the other is the conventional truth, which is what we experience in our day-to-day lives and is explained by the middle path. Buddha's insight was no doubt revolutionary, and he also went on to make a religion out of it. But he was not the only person who arrived at such conclusions independently. Derek Parfit was a British philosopher, a giant in the field of moral philosophy. His claim to fame, apart from looking like Ric Flair, was his seminal paper titled Personal Identity. In it, he tackles the question of what makes you the same person who fell asleep in your bed last night. And no, he isn't talking about one-night stands. Parfit asserts that it must either be physical continuity, having the same brain and body, or psychological continuity, having overlapping memories, desires, and beliefs that make us the same person throughout our lives. But upon further investigation, he concludes that neither of these two can provide a complete and sufficient answer to a person's identity. For instance, physical continuity cannot be personal identity, as every day you shed off billions of old cells that are replaced by completely new cells. This means that since the day you were born, both your brain and your body have gone through multiple iterations of replacement already. But also, Parfit says it cannot be psychological continuity, and he demonstrates this idea using a thought experiment. Imagine that in the future we have the ability to teleport people over large distances in space. But in order to do so, the machine has to completely destroy the person at point A and then reconstruct an exact replica at some far away point B. The newly created person will have the exact same memories, beliefs, and desires as the person who was destroyed. In other words, Parfit wants to highlight that there will exist a kind of psychological continuity between the old and the new person. But consider a situation where the teleportation machine malfunctions and is unable to destroy you at point A. This would leave you with an exact replica of yourself far away in space who shares with you the same memories, desires, and beliefs. This is a conundrum. How can a single person exist with two different bodies? And before you figure that out, there's already some bad news waiting for you. According to the teleportation laws, one of you two needs to be killed in the next 24 hours. The only silver lining is that death will be instant and painless. So, would you kill yourself or the person far away in space? Parfit argues that it shouldn't matter. After all, your replica in space will still carry all of your memories. It will still love your family just as much as you'd have. It will carry out all your dreams and goals and unfinished business just like you'd have. And also, you have teletransported multiple times before, where your body had been destroyed just as usual. But it does matter, doesn't it? It should matter because personal identity is by definition singular. Surely you, Parfit says, have the better claim to being the real you. The person in space is merely an exact replica. And thus he arrives at the conclusion that psychological continuity cannot be the answer to personal identity. So what is it then? What constitutes as personal identity? I don't give a shit, says Parfit. Everything there is to a person can simply be reduced to a set of non-personal facts. This is known as the reductionist theory of the self, and Parfit uses the analogy of nations to explain the idea. A nation, Parfit says, is nothing but a bunch of people living together with common cultural and historical roots. It is nothing more than that. There is no separate identity of the nation as such apart from these things. It can be completely explained by its people and culture and history and geography and so on. Parfit says it's the same way with people. The person consists entirely of his memories, beliefs, and desires, and nothing more than that. Yet we constantly think of ourselves as something extra, something more than our thoughts and beliefs and desires. Like this inner monkey who is hiding in our brains, secretly pulling all the strings from behind. But the truth, Parfit says, is that just like nations, our personal identities can also be reduced to a set of non-personal facts. And any attempts at trying to come up with a self or an identity is just us slapping on a label over these facts for the sake of our own convenience. It's just us being lazy. Notice how similar this sounds to the idea of dependent origination, and Parfit does make it a point to acknowledge this similarity as well. The Buddha would have agreed, he says while presenting this idea in his magnum opus titled Reasons and Persons. In the same book, he also reflects on the numerous implications of this result, and it is worth quoting in full. Is the truth depressing? Some may find it so, but I find it liberating and consoling. When I believed that my existence was such a further fact, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in open air. There is still a difference between my lives and the lives of others, but that difference is less. Other people are closer now. I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the life of others. Parfit is trying to make a case for a kind of compassion that is purely based on reason. His point being that we are more similar to others than we allow ourselves to think. As long as we hold on to the illusion of the self, we will stay trapped inside our own little bubbles, always somewhat concerned about our distant future lives. But thanks to Parfit, we know that there is no such thing as a personal identity. I am not the same person that I was 10 years ago. Let alone years, I'm not even the same person that I was a week ago. Oftentimes, I will find myself writing down notes at the start of the month about things that I want to achieve in the next 30 days. But allow for a few days to pass and I will find it impossible to relate with the guy that had started. That me was so certain, so sure about what he was writing. But this me of today, he couldn't care less. Unfortunately for Parfit, there was no religion named after him. Not even like a small harmless cult in his hometown England. But nevertheless, he did end up making some rather good points. You are just the sum of your parts, and others are the sum of those parts as well. They might be molded in different ways or forged in different fires, but at the end of the day, we're all just the same pieces of shit. So stop acting in your self-interest all the fucking time. You don't have any special reason to care about your future self any more than you have to care about others around you. For all you know, you might have more in common with your spouse or your friends than you do with some distant future self. And when you do that, when we all do that, when we truly begin to see our existence as it really is, compassion will become second nature. And when that happens, we can all achieve nirvana.